Thanks, Rob. It's so great to be with all of you today for Emerge Insights. And I'm really excited to get to have a conversation with my colleague and friend, Fiona Greig. Fiona is a managing director and the co-president at the JPMorgan Chase Institute. And I'm going to let her in a moment tell you a little bit more about the Institute's work. She has also done a number of other things in her career, and that really gives her really a very bird's eye view, if you will, of what's going on in the economy and the country, and particularly with consumers. And so I'm really excited to get to have a conversation with you today. Welcome, Fiona.
Thank you, Jennifer.
So I am a regular consumer of the JPMorgan Chase Institute research, and I think I have some waiting for me in my inbox as we speak. And I've been amazed at the quantity and quality of the work that the Institute has been able to do in its relatively short life. And I think the work has been particularly important, strong, and helpful during this pandemic period. So I wonder if you might just start by telling the audience a little bit more about the work you do at the Institute, the data that you have privy to, and maybe some of your greatest hits, if you will, from the pandemic period.
Well, thanks, Jennifer. It really is great to be here. You have a great day planned. And, you know, the Institute, we started 6 years ago. I think the promise was, you know, the firm JPMorgan Chase, by the time we bank roughly half the households in the US, that's an extraordinary lens on the world. And that extraordinary lens on the world could be incredibly helpful if we were to somehow derive that into insights that could inform policymakers and decision makers and business leaders. And so that was really the remit, right? And so we have, over the course of time, gained access to checking accounts, credit cards, mortgage accounts, small business accounts, brokerage data, and all in a de-identified way, so that we can start to inform in a very integrated way. And that's going to be a key theme here. What's going on in people's financial lives? How are they impacted when life changes, when a pandemic hits, et cetera? And you're right that, over the last 18 months, well, when the pandemic first hit, we had a beautiful research agenda before us, which we basically tore up and said to ourselves, look, actually the game plan for the next while, weeks, months, we had no idea how long, is to just help tell the story, as it's happening to us, right? What's going on with consumer spending? What's going on with income? Who's losing jobs? How are they responding? What's going on with balances, small businesses, et cetera? And so probably two highlights. One is, we really have noticed just how well targeted so much and progressive so much of this extraordinary stimulus and cash support was for families. And that was critical because, of course, job losses were very concentrated among low-wage workers. And that provided a very important macroeconomic boost. Because we saw the spending of low-income families actually increase at a time when, sort of the floor was falling from beneath us, right? So that was one really important insight. And the other is that, by virtue of all of those supports, we have actually seen, cash balances rise for families and small businesses. And so it's been this odd moment of incredible catastrophe, incredible public health crisis and loss. And yet from a financial health perspective, we mitigated a lot of pain. And you can see that quite clearly in the data. So that has been another surprise.
Our data, which I know you're familiar with from the Financial Health Pulse, shows the same thing. And it's almost counterintuitive to think that during a pandemic, we would see financial health scores rise to the point where there are more people financially healthy today in America than since we've started measuring in the last 4 or 5 years. And even from a race and ethnicity perspective, people who have been hit hardest by the pandemic in some ways had the biggest gains. That, of course, doesn't wipe out the significant gap that was there before and remains after. I'm wondering what more your research has to say about how the pandemic affected historically disadvantaged or marginalized communities, and now that we're, fingers crossed, maybe getting to a point where we can start to move forward, what you think, what do you think lies ahead for those communities?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing is clear is the criticality of all of that support, right, was very clear, particularly for Black, Latinx families, low-income families. And so, an illustration of that is, obviously, we saw balances skyrocket with each round of stimulus, and yet we saw them plummet more quickly, or be depleted. They're actually still elevated. So we saw them be depleted more quickly for low-income families, particularly women of color. And so that just goes to show just how critical those supports were specifically for those groups. And that's another, I guess, thing I'm thinking about, Jennifer, which is like, we characterize these as financial health scores and indicators, and yet they're so precarious, right? That those elevated balances, et cetera, are as a result of this very historic and unprecedented and large set of relief programs that were a very liquidity focused, right? It wasn't that we were writing down principal on homes and things like that and helping people with their kind of like big picture balance sheet. We were actually just throwing cash at them in a number of different ways. And yet that cash is fleeting, right? And can be fleeting. And so even as of July of this year, we're still seeing cash balances elevated. And I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, because I'm worried that that's premised on a series of relief interventions, many of which have been rolled back or are not going to be repeated.
Yeah. And, the various bills in Congress that might provide for longer term support and strengthening of the safety net sort of hang in the balance, which makes this also feel like a little bit of an uncertain and precarious time. To that end, a lot of your research over time pre-pandemic has focused, at least a strand of it, on other kinds of government interventions, like the earned income tax credit, for instance, or other kinds of policies that enable families to be resilient and thrive. And as you look and as you think about the past research you've done, and you think about kind of all of the myriad of things that are in these bills in Congress, what do you think holds the greatest promise from a policy perspective? Again, no crystal ball about what might or might not pass. That's not a fair question these days. But what do you think, given the data, is most critical to making sure that we're setting people up for success?
Yeah, well, that's a heavy question for a fireside chat, but I'll take. Look, I think there are. Let me take one step back, actually, because there is a roaring debate right now about why people aren't going back to work, right? And what's holding the worker back? Why do we have a labor shortage, right? And to my mind, and there was a huge debate about the role of unemployment insurance, and surely that was holding people back. And we could detect in the data that, it was having a small impact, but definitely not a big one, and definitely small relative to the spending benefits it was delivering. So then you ask yourself, okay, what else, right? What else is keeping back the worker, and in particular, the female worker, the Black worker, right? And, it could be liquidity. I have more of a cash buffer right now. It could be, and so I don't have to go back to work today. It could be, my daycare is still operating at 75%, and I have reduced hours, and I still have actually more care obligations than I used to. Or it could be, I don't want to go back to restaurant job where I was on my feet all of the time and didn't have proper benefits or paid leave, et cetera. And so it's sort of from that kind of lens that I think about some of the different things that are on the table. And, you know, probably some of the basics are what I would want to see, right? Is like, can we improve working conditions? Can we expand, you know, supports for low wage workers? Can we expand supports for family, for caregivers, for, you know, for childcare? Can we make sure that children are provided for in the form of tax credits and sort of all of those things that may be keeping back you know, the worker of today who sort of was a heroine throughout the pandemic, right? In terms of either providing essential services or being the first job to get cut, right? And so those are the things that I'm pretty fired up about and think are really important.
I appreciate that answer. I think that's a smart way to think about it, especially given the myriad of choices, frankly, because we all know there is no one silver bullet. You know, what I find interesting about this conversation is the nuance with which you're able to speak about the situations that consumers find themselves in. And if you think about the kinds of statistics we tend to hear from the government, the kind of headline numbers, whether it's the GDP numbers or the unemployment numbers, they don't have that same quality. And I wonder if you might reflect a little bit on sort of the role of government data and statistics and where data and insights like the kind that the Institute produces come into play.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I mean, I'm a huge consumer of public data, and I think they play an incredibly important role in giving us, you know, a representative look of what's happening in the economy. And, you know, and the government, to their credit, you know, the household pulse survey, like they rose to the moment too, right, in really important ways. And I think are increasingly thinking about how can they incorporate, you know, private sector and other sources of data into their view of the economy. That being said, I mean, if you just look at, you know, the battery of indicators that they push out, in some sense, it's like they take a very good temperature of one thing at a time, right? How many job openings are there? How many unemployed workers are there? What was wage levels at this time? What is consumer spending? What is GDP? And what's hard with those statistics is to integrate them, right? To say, what was the impact of that job loss on spending? The other thing that's really hard is to characterize the distributional differences, right? What was the impact of this job loss on spending for a low wage worker, for a Black worker, as distinct from a white or Latinx worker? And, you know, that's the kind of, you know, with the benefit of high frequency data, which we also have, and that's another challenge associated with governments. It's a sort of point in time, and they, you know, and they're very regular and they come out, but you don't get that sort of rolling movie of what happened to a number of different dimensions of a person or a business over time. And that's, I think, the power of our data is, you know, we can identify a job loss event for a family. We can document what happened to their income. We can document what happened to their spending, their balances, et cetera. And we can do those, you know, for different kinds of people. And so that's sort of where, that's always, I think, how we try and complement what the government can really put out.
Yeah. You know, you've highlighted the fact that you have access to this very rich transactional and administrative data of the banks and of the bank's customers. You know, the government has its own administrative and transactional data, IRS W-2 data, as an example. You know, I wonder if you had a wish list, you know, what kinds of government data of that sort do you think exist that aren't available today, that if made available could make a really big difference in policymaking ultimately?
Yeah. Well, I want to I want to feature actually the work of the California Policy Lab, which has, been really, I think, at the frontier of, at least for the state of California, gobbling up as many administrative data sets as possible across an array of different departments within the state of California, and then churning out, okay, what are we learning? What are we learning? If not also pairing them together. And so, they did that with unemployment insurance claims in California, and were able to uncover some really important insights, including the ways in which red tape and different administrative burdens were actually causing people to fall off benefits or get delays in benefits and all that sort of thing. But you're right that, at the federal level, the opportunity is huge. And I'll give the example of student loan debt, right? This is a huge policy question. It's a critical element of financial health. It was the fastest growing debt category, prior to the pandemic. Obviously, there's still an administrative forbearance on student loan debt. So the vast majority of Americans aren't making their student loan payments right now. And yet, when we think about how to reform this program, should we cancel it? How do we, mitigate the next dollar of student loan debt, et cetera? There's so many critical pieces of the picture that are missing, right? We have credit bureau data, and members of the Fed and lots of people, CFPB has access to that data, so we can see the debt portfolio, we can see that picture. And yet we don't have the education outcomes, right? Which the Department of Ed does have that data, right? They know whether this person got the degree or not, and that sort of thing. And then the third one is, we don't know the income, right? Of course, the IRS does know that, and that's the return on this investment of this education investment. And so, that's the kind of administrative pairing that, like, not say nothing of just even at least using the data, but then merging it with other sources. And that's hard. And I will say, anytime somebody says, well, your data is amazing, but imagine how amazing it could be if you could just pair it with this other thing. And it's like, yeah, but that's 2 person years, even just to sort that out before we even start playing with it, right? Because it's very hard, especially when you hold yourself to a standard of de-identification and all of the controls that are necessary to use these kind of data, right? So it is hard work, and it also it requires a pretty big investment in the capabilities, right, and the talent with which you need to sort of make sense of these data. A lot of that talent sits in academia and sits in economics departments, et cetera. And how do you bring that talent into these departments and deploy them, not in a one-off way of like, I'd like to write this research paper on this amazing research question I have, but at scale, right, in a way that can power the administration in making their decisions on an ongoing basis, right?
I think you've now just described a new office that needs to be created somewhere in government, and maybe you should run it. But that's a really interesting idea. I don't think that's where you started when you started answering my question, but that's certainly what I heard in your response. We only have a few more minutes together, and I want to touch on one more thing that you mentioned, and that's intersectionality, particularly around race, ethnicity, gender, ability, other kinds of identity and statuses. So important, even more important in the wake of last year's events, George Floyd's murder, racial reckoning, and with the president's own, call for a whole of government approach to equity and inclusion. How do we get there? Right, that data can be hard to come by. It's folks who might want it to do the right thing with it, to really understand the gaps, don't necessarily have access to it. I'm thinking about a large regulated bank like Chase as an example of that. Government has some of it, but it can be very hot button to talk about using that data, even though, again, there is an opportunity to use it for the right purpose. How should we be thinking about that and making sure that we are seizing the momentum of this moment to really make progress in making sure that we have the data and insights we need to close the gaps?
Yeah, such an important question. And we've been on quite a long journey in trying to be able to do race and ethnicity cuts on our work. Of course, these are protected classes in legal speak, right? And so you can't ask somebody what their race is or their gender is when they open a checking account. And so kind of from the starting line, these data aren't available. And so how have we gotten around that? Well, in certain cases, they are available, right? Because for fair lending purposes, right, when you buy a home, we are required to ask that information so that we can verify that we're not discriminating, right? So these data are available in certain circumstances. In other cases, we have brought in third-party data, some of which is public. In one instance, we brought in voter registration files from several states that actually still collect race information when you register to vote, and then paired it based on, behind a privacy curtain, right, based on all of the identifiers, and we were able to pair it and bring it in. And then with that, for a subsample of our customers who live in those states, right? And so it was limited, and so this is a data asset that is totally a work in progress, because in order to say more about more groups and in more places, we obviously need to expand it. I think there's a framework, though, actually kind of coming from this idea of fair lending that we should export more broadly, right? Which is the burden of proof when you start a new credit product or something is that you're not discriminating. But maybe we should export that burden of proof to millions of other decisions we make as a government, right? Like, oh, we give out unemployment insurance benefits. Are they received in a racially equal way, right? Why not? Isn't it the burden of proof? Shouldn't the burden of proof be on us as a government to, fix that? And, maybe I'm setting a very high bar, but at least sort of step one would be, okay, well, even just to answer that question, what data would we need in order to interrogate it, right? And that the first burden of proof it creates is the requirement that we be able to know that information and assess the disparities.
Right. I couldn't agree more with you. And, maybe the answer is flipping the equation on its head, not to suggest that we stop with fair lending and, hey, is what you're doing discriminating? But in these other use cases, it's what are you doing to continue to reduce inequities? We know they exist. That's
Yes.
not a surprise, right?
Right.
The question is, can we document that we're continuing to reduce them? And maybe that feels less punitive in some way in these other kinds of situations. But to be continued. I could talk to you for much longer, but I need to get on with the rest of the program. So thank you, Fiona, so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jennifer. Great to be here.